Hello party people, and welcome to the crater of the volcano Eldfell in the Westman Islands. It's an overcast day. It was kind of funny, somebody was remarking recently on one of my YouTube videos. They're like, oh Brent, it seems like everywhere that you go it's overcast and rainy in Iceland. Pro tip, if you're looking for constant sunshine and clear skies, you don't come north to the Arctic Circle. Travel pro tip. Not a lot to see in the in the crater of the volcano. This volcano erupted back in 1973 for about 6 months. When it erupted in the middle of the night, they had to evacuate the island. It's a very tiny island off the south coast of Iceland. Had to evacuate the island, and just by luck of the draw, it just happened that the previous day was a really bad weather at sea, so they had all the fishing boats in the harbor, so the townspeople could just go down to the harbor and then evacuate off of the fishing boats, go on to mainland Iceland. Volcano erupted for like 6 months, and as it erupted, made the island bigger and bigger, so it ended up that they could have more space for homes. They could use the volcanic material to build more homes, and then they also used it to expand for an airport. Made the land so much bigger, it became an airport. I'm always amazed at how light this rock is. This pumice type stuff, I'm always amazed by how light some of this material is. I just never thought about that in terms of volcanic ash. Makes for really light building materials. So these days it's mostly tourism out here. Tourism for puffins, fishing, and of course hiking around on the volcano. I am not the kind of person who likes to hike, so I'm the kind of person who likes to drive. So of course thus I drove up here rather than hike. So let's go through and answer some of your questions from office hours. Let's see here. First up, we have Beggar asks, do you notice big performance improvements on dedicated physical servers as compared to a VM on a VMware cluster? I find myself begging for resources. I'm thinking about switching from VM to physical. I'm thinking about switching from virtual to physical. I love it. Yeah, sure. You're just going to waltz into your CEO's office and you're going to be like, hey, you know what? I've decided that I want to switch. So setting that aside, the comic realities of you're not just going to waltz in and tell people what you want, given that you're attending this YouTube video. So what are some of the reasons why you'd see better performance on a physical host as opposed to a virtual host, or virtual guest? One of the reasons is that generally when people buy VM hosts, they tend to focus on getting lots of cores, so they end up with slow CPUs. They don't get really fast CPUs, they just get a lot of cores. Well, your virtual machine probably isn't using all of the cores, and you would probably want faster clock speeds if you're CPU bottlenecked. You tend to see faster performance if you go with bare metal, not because there's some big overhead for virtualization, but because you would right size the host so that you wouldn't have so many CPU cores. You would get faster cores and less of them because SQL Server is so expensive on a per core licensing basis. Another reason is that there are things that you can do with a physical box that you can't do with virtual easily. For example, you could get a pair of mirrored solid state drives, put them locally for TempDB, and then this alleviates problems with writes due to the version store or query execution plan spills. It's not that you couldn't do that with a virtualization host. You could, in theory, but most likely you're not going to be able to because your VMware sysadmins are going to say, pin a single guest to just one host. That violates all the cool stuff that we're trying to get out of virtualization. So those are just examples of some of the reasons why you tend to see better performance out of physical than virtual. I am a believer that every SQL server should start as a virtual box and then only go to physical as like a last resort. And knowing when it's time to go due to the last resort involves monitoring what your top weight types are, like I teach you in my Mastering Server Tuning class. Monitor for what your top weight types are, and then try to fix those first with T-SQL and index code change, T-SQL code and index changes, SQL Server settings changes, and so forth. And then changing where you're hosted is such a last resort because it is so big and ugly and expensive. So think like a consultant. Look for the low-hanging fruit, the easiest thing to change. And it's not usually the place where you're hosting it. It's usually changes to the T-SQL code or indexes or SQL Server settings that really get you across the finish line quickly. All right, next up, let's see what we've got here. So next up is, turns out the Volcano, I get 4G signal out in a volcano crater. Next up is Essential Oils asks, I have a couple of SQL servers that are not using all of the available RAM in the system. Why is that? There are two perfmon counters you're going to want to look at. There are two perfmon counters, target memory and total memory. If you search for SQL Server perfmon counters, target memory and total memory, you'll get the exact location of these perfmon counters. Target memory is how much memory SQL Server is willing to use. Generally, that's going to be your max server memory setting. Target memory is how much SQL Server is willing to use. Total is how much it's actually using. You might have a situation where target is not high enough, that SQL Server isn't willing to use that much memory. If you think your target memory counter is too low, check your max server memory setting or check other services installed on the box, because you might have other services that are using up too much memory. Generally, what I find in that situation is that somebody didn't set max memory appropriately. If total memory isn't high enough, like you got a really high target like 64 gigs, but total memory is only, say, 16 gigs, it can be because your SQL Server just started up. SQL Server doesn't use memory until it's actually needed. It could be because you've got small databases and there's just not that much of a need to cache them. The way that I would start is I would run dbcc checkdb on one of your larger databases and see if that forces SQL Server to use more memory. Just keep in mind that if SQL Server hasn't used that much, total is low but target is high, it just hasn't needed it yet. So just let it be. Don't concern yourself too much about it if that is the case. Next up we have, let's see here, Fresco says, do you recommend periodic SQL Server restarts? No, but I do recommend patching. I see a whole lot of people who are focused on, hey, we've got 3 years worth of uptime. Yeah, but there have been like 400 critical bugs that have been fixed in the years since your SQL Server has been restarted. So maybe be a little less braggadocious, there's your word of the day, maybe be a little less braggadocious about your uptime and a little bit more concerned about patching. So start with patching. SQL Server cumulative updates come out every 30 to 90 days, depending on which version you're on. If you're on 2016, of course, that thing's baked, 2016 or earlier. Do I recommend patching for SQL Server on those? Obviously, there are no more patches coming out for 2016 or earlier, unless they eventually ship a 2016 Service Pack 3 like they've been talking about doing for years. But you're going to have Windows patches, and Windows patches are just as important. So every 30, 60, 90 days as those patches come out, you should be restarting. I wouldn't restart more frequently than every 30, 60, 90 days. It's not like, there have been memory leak bugs in the past, but whenever you restart SQL Server, not only are you flushing the cache and you're forcing SQL Server to build new plans, read things back up from disk, etc., you're flushing all kinds of juicy management metrics too, that if you want to see performance, it's really helpful to look at these metrics over time. But unfortunately, most of them are only kept in memory. So when you restart SQL Server, you're banging a bottle over its head and it's going to forget all of that stuff. I wouldn't, the other thing is I can't really put that much faith into the management metrics if the server's been up for 3, 6, 7 months. Because you might have had a performance problem 3, 6, 7 months ago and you no longer have it today. I can't put that much faith in wait statistics or index usage numbers or plan cache numbers when the server's been up for like 6 months, just because your server and your application may have changed over that time. Next up, we have Perfect World, who asks, how many times have you encountered a SQL Server in top shape, which you didn't have to do anything to improve performance? Oh, that's an interesting question. So my answer here is colored by the fact that I'm a consultant and I cost money. Someone is going to have to pay for all these trips to places like Iceland and for all of my toys. So because I'm a consultant and I cost money, it's very rare that I love this. His name is Flackery. Someone has to pay for all these cool toys, so it's rare that someone's going to call me up and be like, "Yo, Brent, I'd like to give you $5,000-$10,000 to look at a server where people are happy." People generally only call me when they're very unhappy. That's the life of a consultant. I have had a lot of issues where I've said, oh, the problem isn't what you think it is, the problem is something else. And that has happened, like, oh, the server's actually in top shape, but you have this setting done incorrectly. Change this setting and then everything's going to be different. That's happened, but it's very rare that someone comes to me and says, here you go, here's $10,000, go look at this SQL server. And I'd be like, oh no, there's nothing to see here. It's extremely rare. Every now and then it happens, and it's an app problem or something downstream kind of problem. It's not SQL Server itself or your code or your indexes, and they just need a rubber stamp of validation from someone who they go, yep, here we spent 10 grand on Brent Ozar and he said that it's totally okay, just to prove to someone else, like a third-party app vendor, that it really is their code. It's super rare. If you'd like to give me your money, if you think that you have a perfectly configured SQL Server and everyone's happy, if you would like to give me your money, by all means, go to brentozar.com and click consulting up at the top. I would love to take your money. Lots of your money. It's not really true. Fresco, no, I'm down past that. That was the restart one. Let's see here. He asked it twice. Philip says, what are your thoughts on using using extended events over Profiler? I've tried to switch over to extended events and I found the interface dreadful. When extended events first came out, I couldn't stand it because it was like written for developers by developers. It was, if you liked coding T-SQL to read XML, which I understand that developers like XML and or at least will tolerate XML, then it was fine. But for those of us who didn't think in XML, it was a giant pain in the rear. So when I had to write T-SQL to do XML, I hated extended events. But over time, gradually, as people as people implemented third-party scripts, things like SP Blitzlock, things like Eric Darling's SP Human Events, where they handle the XML part for you, oh, I'm all over that. That's fantastic. So just like you wouldn't take two stones and rub them together in order to use tools these days, you would switch to more modern tools. I find that as long as you use more modern tools, then extended events is fantastic. The two places to start would be SP Blitzlock, which relies on extended events, and Eric Darling's phenomenal SP Human Events. SP Human Events, what it does is it takes a parameter called, if I remember right, event type, which is the kind of problem that you're trying to solve. Are you trying to solve blocking? Are you trying to solve recompile problems? It sets up an extended events profile or extended events session, waits for a matter of seconds, and then stops the trace and then analyzes what changed over that time, reports it out to you in the kind of format that would be useful based on the troubleshooting you're trying to do. It has different outputs depending on what it is that you're troubleshooting, like blocking, execution plan compiles, and so forth. So phenomenal, can't recommend it enough. Eric Darling's SP Human Events. Next up, Kevin says, I've watched a few office hours now. Thank you. Philosophical question. Why do you think so many people keep trying to ask you questions outside of PollGab? Oh, he's talking about when I do live ones in front of the computer. People will constantly dump questions into the YouTube chat. He says, why do so many people keep trying to ask you questions outside of PollGab? I'm frustrated just watching them pop up. Love the office hours, Brent. Thanks, glad you like them. The reason why people ask so many questions in the wrong place is because they don't read the directions. That's it. That's the punchline. People don't read the directions. I am very thankful to that, though, because people like you and I who do read the directions are able to make a magnificent living just doing exactly what the directions say. So it makes it way easier. So on one hand, I hate them. On the other hand, I think they're kind of magical. I'm going to move the camera around a little here because there's a gorgeous view over here as well. Let's move this over and then recenter that. There it goes. All right, cool. Next up, let's see what we've got here. I'm a null set. That's pretty good. I like it. I'm a null set asks, hi Brent, is there a way to influence which keys SQL Server uses as the range high key in statistics? If certain keys have a lot more rows than others, the cardinality estimator may do a bad job if the predicate key is in the middle of a bucket rather than being the range high key. Okay, so this is a little bit more advanced question, and for those of you who don't understand the question, if you want to learn more about it, on our YouTube channel, there is a class about SQL Server statistics. Go watch that class. Totally free. It's like 10 videos long, has all kinds of good stuff. It was originally recorded by Doug Lane out of Iowa. But for those of you who understand this specific question, I'm going to reword the question as, what do I do when 200 buckets isn't enough? Because if you're worried micromanaging the keys, what you're really worried about is, I want better execution plans for specific values, like for specific parameters. In that, if you really want that, that's what filtered statistics are for. Take a look at filtered statistics. Anytime I give an answer, though, I always kind of want to say how many times in the last year or two I've actually used it. I don't think there's been a case in the last 10 years, I think it's probably been 10 years ago when I was working with Stack Overflow, where I would have even considered filtered statistics. I'm not saying they're bad, they're fine. I just want to give you perspective on how often I would actually use that kind of thing. So if you really are that desperate, I would check out filtered statistics. What I usually find is the problem when people think that they need filtered statistics is that SQL Server can't understand what's inside your where clause anyway, or there are so many steps involved with go get this from this table, then this from this table, then this from this table. Then I want you to use the value that results out of statistics, and that's not what SQL Server does anyway. It only uses those statistics at the very beginning of query plan compilation when it needs to, and it has to be kind of hand-fed those values. But if you need that, that's what filtered statistics are for. Next up, Steven says, hi Brent, why does a hash match join spill to TempDB when the estimates are 100% accurate and the used memory is lower than granted? Ooh, why does a hash match spill to TempDB when the estimates are 100% accurate and the used memory is lower than granted? Okay, so this is going to be a little bit, I almost want to sketch out an answer here. So think about an execution plan, the plan that you're having the problem with. Think about, close your eyes and visualize for a second an exploding volcano, and I really hope that doesn't happen today. Visualize an execution plan with all kinds of query plan operators. The memory in the plan isn't all available to one of the operators. You may have a case where one query plan operator was given a certain amount of memory. Other operators have memory freely available, but this operator didn't have enough at the time that it executed. That's one cause. A second cause that it can be is parallelism. And I love this. I discuss it in detail in my mastering query tuning class with demos. But essentially, the memory is evenly distributed for one operator. The memory is evenly distributed across all of the threads, but not all of the threads may have data. This is one of the reasons why you don't want to go wild and crazy with maxstop. You don't want to let SQL Server do an unlimited number of worker threads for a query or breaking tasks across logical cores. Because if all your data just ends up on one core, you'll end up spilling to disk like crazy on that one core, even though the other cores have memory available for that particular operation. So those are the two causes. Next up, and I should be specific too, the reason why I said there's only two causes is because you were good about saying that the memory used isn't as high as the total memory allocated for the query. The other thing that hits all the time on there is imagine that you have a query that's dealing with a terabyte of data and you only got 64 gigs of RAM. That's a different situation, but Kevin was good about specifying clearly in his query or in his question that wasn't the case. Mache asks, hi Brent, you said that you're working with both SQL Server and Postgres. What's a feature for SQL Server you're missing the most while working with Postgres? Oh, missing indexes. Oh my gosh, it's not even close. Missing indexes. Oh, I know I make fun of Clippy constantly. I'm constantly joking about how Clippy's logic is terrible and he asks for things that he doesn't use and he doesn't put an order on the keys and all kinds of stuff. But you know what is better than nothing? And over in Postgres, nothing is what I get by default. So because I'm not that good at analyzing an entire workload for Postgres, it would be magical to have missing index recommendations just dumped out for Postgres. Somebody in the comments is going to be like, well, if you install these 3 poorly documented open source modules, you'll get it. I know that, but if I have to deal with all that, then I'm going to be good enough to tune indexes anyway. Just literally last week, Richie made an improvement to SQL Constant Care. We had one of our operations was timing out all the time because it needed an index, and we just didn't know. Poor Richie had to go and tune it in by hand. Next, and in the same question, Mache says, in addition, is there a feature in Postgres that you would love to see in SQL Server? So I've blogged about non-logged tables before. I don't actually have a need to use them in the use case that I'm working on with Postgres, SQL Constant Care. I don't really need non-logged tables. Is there one that I would go crazy for? Oh yeah, no, that's easy. The licensing cost, but as in there isn't any. Next up, Mahesh says, which, I mean, really, that's kind of a good thing to talk about there. Postgres is really good for the price. Is it perfectly as good as SQL Server? Of course not. But is it really good for the price? Yeah, it's really, really good for the price. Next up, Mahesh says, hi Brent, the query execution time takes 3 to 5 minutes, but the data transfer time from the remote SQL Server to Management Studio on my laptop takes more time. Is there a solution which can speed up things and reduce the transfer time since millions of rows are returned as the output? Mahesh, it almost sounds like you're trolling me. If you need millions of rows worth of data, you don't want to run the query across the network via SSMS to your underpowered laptop. What you want to do is export those millions of rows on the SQL Server themselves, SQL Server itself. Export the data to a flat file, to whatever format that you need, and then move that over to the next machine for processing. But you're not really going to process millions of rows on your laptop. Tools to accomplish this include SSIS and Azure Data Factory. But if you regularly find yourself tuning a process that moves millions of rows in Management Studio, you're using the wrong tool. You're trying to bang sticks together or bang stones together to accomplish something hard. Look at a more modern tool like SSIS or Azure Data Factory. And to put it another way, when I'm working with developers, if someone says this process is slow and I look at it and it's returning more than 10,000 rows, I'm like, hold up, why are we returning more than 10,000 rows to the client? Let's see what we can do more efficiently rather than using SQL servers like a data dump truck. Next up, Fraud asks, when I'm using log shipping, can I still perform a full and log backup of the primary database without breaking log shipping to the secondary database? Can you perform a full backup? Yes. Can you perform log backups? No. Transaction log shipping is a technique where you're just continuously restoring log backups over to another SQL server. You don't want to inject more log backups. If you need those log backups for some reason, just go to the folder where you're doing your log shipping backups to and copy out whatever files that you want. But there's no need to do separate log backups. Just like the Highlander, there can be only one. I've never actually seen that movie. I've seen bits and pieces of it, but all right. Next up, Armand asks, can an index with the same name as an existing column cause conflicts with statistics creation and SQL Query Planner? No. They can't all be long answers. Next up, Marcus the German. I like that too. Marcus the German says, hi Brent, a friend of mine would like to know your thoughts about using backup devices for database backups in SQL Server rather than just files. Devices are an antiquated concept that came out like 20 years ago, back when we actually had, I know you're going to find this hard to believe, but we had tapes, magnetic tapes. Like, you know how duct tape that you use in order to repair things? It was like that, except it was magnetic. And I don't mean that you would like stick it to something in order to get it to repair. It was like very tiny amounts of magnetism. There were little elves that ran around reading these little magnets. And they would drag the tape across at high speed, and all these elves would be working furiously in the data center, reading other things off of this magnetic tape. Back then, I want to say this was 1600s ballpark. Back then, sure, backup devices made sense, but today it doesn't make any sense. Next up, we have Steve says, hi Brent, do you have kids? No, no I don't. We had a dog at one point for about a decade, but that's about it. I always thought I would want kids and that I would be a great father, but then I ended up with a wonderful angel of a woman who did not want kids. And by the time, like I was like, okay, well, we'll get older and you'll decide whether whether that's really the case or whether you want kids later. I wasn't like holding out hope, but I just was like, okay, we'll make that decision again later in our life just to double check. And by the time we like circled around to double check, I was so spoiled with my lifestyle that I'm like, yeah, no, I don't really want kids. Kids would stop me from having things like a Porsche and a Jaguar and a Land Rover Defender and traveling around the world. So yeah. No regrets. Ricardo asks, how do I deal with a manager who insists on choosing which technologies IT should use? Ricardo, I'm a manager. And when I hired my developer, Richie, you know what I sat down with him and said? I said, here are the technologies we're going to use. Okay, so I should answer it then. So how should you deal with a manager like me who lays down and says, these are the technologies that I want to use? If you don't like that decision, if the manager is giving you a list of technologies and you don't believe in that decision, ask them why. Ask them why they want to use that technology. For example, when Richie and I sat down and I said, here's what I want to use: AWS Lambda, I want to use AWS Aurora with Postgres, I want to use, give a queue-driven design. When I sat down with Richie and we sat down and sketched out what the architecture for Pace the Plan would look like, or the architecture for SQL Constant Care, he's an architect. I hired him to be an architect. I don't know a line of code. I don't know jack about how any of that stuff works. But I'm like, the reason why that kind of thing was important to me is I wanted extremely low support costs. I didn't mind taking more time up front to do development, especially with unproven technologies like AWS Lambda and AWS Aurora. I didn't mind taking more time up front for development costs in exchange for less time or less money spent down the road to hire things like sysadmins and support people. Because I wanted it to just be basically me and Richie and as many other developers as we ended up being able to profitably sustain. But I didn't want an army of support people. I don't want to manage databases, for example. I don't want to be on call when the database breaks. So we talked through and I explained why, and he agreed, and off we went to the races. If you believe that your manager is not making good technology decisions or doesn't have enough information, ask them why they're making the decisions that they are. I'm a huge believer that when two people know the same facts, they will come to the same conclusion. So your job is to sit down and ask the manager for the facts that you don't have. And you can't ask it as like, the hell made you think of this decision? You know, what do you think you know? But you want to be like, okay, so cool. What are the reasons why we're choosing that platform? And then on the flip side, make sure that you listen. Don't just say that you're listening, but actually listen. Then on the flip side is you want to also share the facts that you have, not opinions, the facts that you have that lead you away from that decision into something else. And then you lay all that out, explain why you feel the way that you do, and they'll explain why they feel the way that they do. You're allowed to bring that up one other time. This process is called two and done. You're allowed to, as in two, and you're done. You're allowed to bring it up and have the debate again one more time. If you still don't agree, lay down your differences and just continue marching in the direction that you're being paid to march. Sometimes people are stubborn, sometimes managers are making the wrong decisions, but they shouldn't ever bring it up a third time. If you want to bring it up a third time, go find yourself a different job. Next up, Andrew says, how much, is a manager question, how much training and professional development should I let my direct reports do in my work time? I'm in business intelligence in a small team, so there's a lot more on the job skills required, lots of hats. We do lots more training than the operations and web development teams, and there's an imbalance. There's a common saying amongst managers, what if we train our people and they leave? Or what if we don't train our people and they stay? When you're working in a rapidly evolving area like business intelligence, oh my gosh, the tools and the techniques are changing all the time. When you're working in a rapidly evolving area, you have to train all the time. When you're working in a relatively stagnant area, like, and you said systems, TCP/IP, networking, Windows, those are changing, but the pace is so much slower that they don't need a lot of on-the-job training time. Whereas something like business intelligence is rapidly evolving, you see a lot of on-the-job training time. So you should expect a lot of that time. Next up, Oleg asks, Brent, if we need to pass some information from the client that will be available for the whole session, for example, things like client login, which method would you recommend? Populating session context, creating a temp table when the connection opens, or perhaps some other method? So I don't know enough about session context. Like, it's just not something that I've had to deal with. So if there's data that you need to work with, call me crazy, but I'm a big believer in putting it in the database. If you need to work with data, you put it in the database. I'm being funny there. It's hard to tell because I don't have much of a humor face when I'm doing that. But for me, the big payoff would be put it in a temp table if it's going to do things like influence queries, for example. I'm not a big believer in putting it in the context because queries can override that. Queries can change the contents of the context. So, I mean, not that they can't change the stuff in a temp table too, but people think it's going to be immutable and it's not. I don't have anything against context. If you wanted to use that, I'm completely okay with it. I just don't. So I'm sure there are great arguments for doing it. All right, and then we have one other highly upvoted question. Small Butt says, have you ever considered or advised someone to turn on Traceflag 4199 on a server that holds only databases with compat level 130 or above? Not on the entire server level, because 4199 turns on or changes so much behavior at the across all of your queries. If there's a case where a query needs 4199, I'm a much bigger fan of using option query trace on. It's a hint. that you can use in the query itself that enables 4199's behavior. So because +2, at the point where you're looking at 4199's behavior, you probably have enough control that you're able to change the queries. If you're not able to change the queries, 4199 just changes so much behavior across all queries that are running on the entire server that for me it's been a bad bet. I'm not saying that no one should turn it on. I'm sure that there are people out there somewhere, I don't know where they're at, people out there somewhere where they're actually pays off to turn it on. You just asked if I'd done it, and I haven't. All right, so it is, I have no idea what time it is, 7:38. Oh, now I got to go find out if any coffee shops in here on the island are open. So we're here on the island for the entire week. We're going to be, I said the island, so it's the Westman Islands. There's one island or city, Jaime, which is where we're staying through the course of this week. Big thing to do on this island this time of year is the baby puffins, aka pufflings, hatch, and they need to head towards the ocean, but often they can't find the ocean for reasons that will be immediately apparent to anyone who is looking at this. And they get confused by the bright lights of the city, I use that term loosely, the bright lights of the city, and they end up going towards the bright lights rather than towards the moon's reflection on the water. So around this time of year, what you do overnight is you go rescue the baby pufflings who are walking around downtown Jaime. Rescue those, you weigh them, and after they're weighed, you go let them loose next to the ocean so that they can have an easier time of life. Huge bird life here on Jaime. So hopefully we'll get some videos of me running around chasing pufflings and capturing those. I can't wait to see them. We've seen puffins a lot, but this pufflings is a new one for us. So thanks, y'all, and I will see y'all next time in office hours. Adios.